Hey everybody, my name's Roger and I'm with Kinsta. I'm joined today by a good friend Chris Hinds from Equalize Digital. Hey Chris, how are you?
I'm doing great, man. It's good to be back so soon.
Yes, we've been talking more and more about accessibility, and I'm loving the insights that you're sharing with me. And I'm really excited about today's webinar because we're really getting out of the brass tacks of it. We're talking about budgeting for accessibility and really diving into, as an agency, how you should be approaching accessibility. And I'm really excited for your presentation. I'd love to jump right into it, but before we do, is there anything kind of highlights you want to point out for people so they stay tuned in?
Um, I think I'll just share that I have spent literal hours and hours the last few days trying to come up with ways to make this topic engaging because I know for some people, like numbers and planning, it's like, hammering a nail into their forehead. It's like the last thing they want to do. So I'm going to do some storytelling. I'm going to go through some scenarios. I will get into like definitions and specifics, but I'm going to try to make it interesting. So I hope you all stick around and I'm ready to dive in. I'm super excited to share this.
Sweet, let's go for it.
All right, cool. I'm going to share my screen here and hopefully the technology does what it is supposed to do.
And I want to mention while we're getting all that going, people, if you have questions on LinkedIn, please throw a comment into the chat here. I'm keeping an eye on it. And if you ask a really great question, I'll even interrupt Chris in the middle of his presentation.
Sounds awesome. I love it. So for anyone who didn't miss the introduction already, I'm Chris Hinds. I'm the COO at Equalize Digital. I spend, I would say, 50 to 60% of my time talking to agencies, to freelancers, and to all sorts of other organizations inside and outside the WordPress space and doing early stage consulting around accessibility and trying to match them up with the right solutions and the right approaches and hearing all about what they're doing right and helping them spot gaps or what they're doing wrong. So I think that makes me uniquely qualified to talk about budgeting for accessibility. So this is one of what I hope will be a two-part presentation. And you can let Kinsta know if you're interested in this topic by liking, sharing, and supporting this wonderful free education that they're putting out there, Kinsta and Roger, and let them know that you want to see part two of this, and I'll come back and I'll teach you even more. But what we're talking about today is we're talking about budgeting for accessibility and unlocking cost-effective strategies for building accessible websites. So in this first part, what I'm hoping to cover and what we will be covering is the two most common ways that I've seen agencies approach accessibility. They kind of fall into two buckets. The key reasons why organizations lack accessibility budgets, or if they have them, they often have gaps. A detailed breakdown of what I believe the accessibility essentials, and for our listening audience, if there are any, I'm doing air quotes there, that should receive budget consideration, and the very real cost of accessibility debt. I do also want to say what this presentation is not. So what this presentation is not is dictating what you absolutely have to budget for in every project. I'm also not here to shame you if you can't budget for some things. And I'm not really going to dig deep into the compliance territory of accessibility, so like accessibility laws and complying with laws. This is purely about budgeting and planning and trying to make that aspect of it interesting and also doing it effectively. So let's dive in. And to start us off, I want to tell a story of two very different digital agencies, both of whom have been tasked with building an accessible website. Let's see what this project looks like. So a US nonprofit organization has approached these two agencies. They need a brochure website with a custom design and some simple functionality like a contact form. And they tell both agencies with absolute clarity that they need it to be accessible. This nonprofit accepts federal funds, so they have to meet accessibility standards by law. They got back two proposals, one for each of these agencies, and at face value, putting ourselves in the shoes of the nonprofit and just looking at the numbers on these two slides, we can see that one of these looks better. So we have the Hare agency's proposal that has a 9-week proposed timeline and a $13,500 budget, and then we have the Tortoise agency's proposal where it has a 12-week proposed timeline and an $18,000 budget. And if some people are familiar with the source material of this story, you might be able to already see where I'm going with this, but please humor me. We're going to make it relevant. So both of these agencies, if it's not clear already, are going to approach accessibility very differently. And I want to play this out for both agencies and kind of see what the results are. And by the way, this is based on real conversations around real projects that I have talked to agencies about and kind of comparing and contrasting different approaches. So the Hare agency, as we've already seen, is all about speed. They turn around projects quickly at a lower per project cost, and that's how they aim to generate their profit. So turn and burn. Their project plan is defined based on design and functionality needs only. And to kind of shoehorn in accessibility because they know that's a requirement, they're going to bring in an accessibility specialist during the QA phase. Sounds reasonable, right? Designers focus purely on the subjective aesthetics of the design and the customer's tastes, as well as general best practice and driving the client's business objectives. We get through the design phase quickly. The client loves the designs. Hooray, everyone's celebrating. The developers then implement using builders, themes, and plugins that allow them to meet the design and technical briefs the fastest way possible because, again, it's all about speed, right? And the project actually ends up reaching QA in record time. Again, hooray, this is looking really good. And then we get to QA and testing. And this is when the accessibility specialist is brought in and they're going to do a full evaluation with screen readers, keyboards, and they're going to audit a representative sample. And what comes out of this, unfortunately, for the Hare agency is a staggering number of accessibility errors that get discovered throughout because of the different tools they're using and the speed through which they move through the earlier phases of the project. This is really awkward because the customer then has to be informed that their project is going to take longer and might cost more, and some uncomfortable, to put it lightly, negotiations ensue about scoping, pricing, and timeline. Customer ends up very much not happy. The Hare agency ends up spending about 50% longer than they expected on delivery, and they end up eating the cost to avoid a bad review from this customer because they're trying to break into the nonprofit space and they don't want a bad reputation. The project actually results in a net financial loss, and everyone had to work 65-hour weeks because, again, the Hare agency is all about turn and burn. So this project extending ended up causing it to overlap with other projects that were already slated with start dates in their pipeline. Everyone's working overtime trying to make up for these deficiencies. So that's the Hare agency. Let's contrast that with the Tortoise agency, which frequently competes with the Hare agency. They've heard before from others, and including like bids they've lost, that their competitor, the Hare agency, frequently charges less and promises faster turnaround, but they don't budge. Why is that? Well, let's find out. So a project plan is again defined at the very beginning, but it's based on design, functionality, and accessibility requirements. And the customer's brand colors at the very start of the project actually undergo an accessibility review, and a small amount of time is already going to be added to each phase of the project to allow them breathing room to consider accessibility at every milestone. Designers balance aesthetics and the client's business objectives with accessibility requirements, understanding that that's something that the customer wants to do. And a specialist is brought in to review a small handful of the key designs and point out potential accessibility issues before we're even writing any code. Then the developers use builders, themes, plugins from a pre-vetted list of solutions that they already know ahead of time have accessibility-friendly outputs, and automated tests during development for accessibility are run, and any issues that are identified are fixed before they even get to QA. Then, during testing, an accessibility specialist is brought in, just the same as the Hare agency, to evaluate what was built, and a small number of accessibility issues are still discovered, but it's manageable, and the dev team can easily get those knocked out before it's submitted to the customer for final approval. And then the Tortoise agency ends up spending about the amount of time that they expected on delivery. The project is profitable and it was delivered on time, and the customer is happy with the result. So here are those results kind of broken out here. And they're based on real world conversations, again, that I've had with agency owners. So the Hare agency ended up actually taking 14 weeks and not 9 to complete the project. They had a $2,700 loss and the customer was not happy. Contrast that with the Tortoise agency. They had a 12-week real timeline. They met their timeline objective. The customer is satisfied. They had $4,500 in profit. Accessibility is a lot like building inspections and new construction. If I were to contrast it with a real-world example, you don't wait until the end when all the drywall and the finishes are added. You consider the building code and its safety inspections during laying the foundation, framing the exterior, wiring and plumbing, drywall and fixtures, and then finishes. It's considered at every stage. Ultimately, it saves time and it saves money doing it that way. Now, many of the agencies that I speak with are strikingly similar to the Hare agencies. So if you're seeing a little bit of yourself in the Hare, don't feel bad or called out. You aren't alone. In fact, you're probably with the majority. So why do most agencies fail to plan for this effectively? I think it really comes down to 4 reasons, and they also happen to line up with like the stage of accessibility maturity in an organization. So at the very beginning stages, maybe accessibility is a completely new concept to them and they're gathering information. Or next stage, they're aware of accessibility, but there's no in-house champion to build a comprehensive program or to work on that. Or next stage, accessibility is being championed in-house, which is great, but there's a lack of buy-in from leadership. Or, and this is even, we see this in the final stage, where we are enthusiastic about accessibility. There's a champion, leadership has bought in, but there's still gaps that exist because there's misinformation or false beliefs about what is actually possible. All that to say, I want to share a nugget of kind of cold, hard truth here, which is a project's budget is the purest reflection of its priorities, right? So am I saying you have to crank up all your project budgets to the max for accessibility? No, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that if accessibility isn't represented in a project budget, it won't ever be a priority. And the key is to have it represented at multiple phases of a project, not just once. It really is that simple. So depending on the project, you may or may not need some of these, but what I want to do is run through the definitions of what I'm calling the accessibility essentials. And we're going to break all of these down individually after I go through these definitions. So first up, we have automated testing tools. This is software that performs tests to identify accessibility defects with little to no human intervention. Really cost effective, really effective at helping you catch low-hanging fruit. And these tools over time are becoming more and more sophisticated and can identify more and more of the spectrum of accessibility. Though most experts agree that it's somewhere between 30 and 40% of issues is what they can detect, which is why we need accessibility evaluation, the next item on this list, which is human evaluation to identify a more comprehensive list of accessibility defects against accepted standards, which most typically you'll hear WCAG or Web Content Accessibility Guidelines thrown around. And this is the international standard that a lot of us are trying to meet when we consider accessibility. Accessibility remediation is what it sounds like. It's fixing accessibility issues that were identified during an automated test or an audit by altering source code or content according to expert recommendations or according to what that automated testing tool is telling you. And then we have some content-specific accessibility essentials. So first is captioning, transcription, and audio description. This is text versions of audio content, so that's captions or transcripts, and then narrated descriptions of visual elements or audio description for accessibility. Then we have ASL interpretation. So this is translating spoken language into American Sign Language for the deaf and hard of hearing community, typically accompanying some sort of video or audio recording. And then we have doc and PDF accessibility. And this is ensuring that any text documents, so like PDFs or docs or spreadsheets, are designed and formatted to be accessible to users with disabilities, including those that are using screen readers. So one thing that I will mention for each of these is, as we go through these definitions in more detail, is the project phase where these essentials become relevant. And for this, I'm going to use what I consider to be typical project phases in a website project. So that's discovery, content, design, development, QA, and launch. Your phases may look slightly different. And in those cases, I just try to match what I'm saying to whatever model you're using as closely as you can.
Excellent.
So first up, was there a question?
No questions. I think this is just, we've gotten a lot of information here. I want to just pause for just a second and kind of, absorb all of this. So, as a Hare agency, right, I can empathize with that, right? Because you want to be as cheap as possible. You want to be as quick as possible. That's what the client wants to hear. Is there like one suggestion that you have for those agencies, who, accessibility becomes a requirement? You're saying, hey, start working this earlier into the conversations. I guess one of the top points would be to a client is, hey, you have an accessibility requirement. We have to consider this. What's like one way at least that you suggest clients bring this up to their clients?
I'm going to dig into this a little bit more later in the presentation, but I think I want to answer immediately too. So there will be more details later, is my point. But I think there's two things you can do. The first is, and this always worked for me, but it was generally for higher ticket website projects where they're like, XYZ provider is less expensive than you or can do it faster. And it sounds a little egotistical to say this, but I would just say something to the effect of, we've done a lot of the type of work, insert type of work that customer wants. And we know what it takes to do it correctly. And when we propose a budget and a timeline, what we do not do and will never do is take the budget and timeline you want and try to shove the scope into it. What we do is we take the scope you want and we work backwards to identify a budget and a timeline that will 100% guarantee that you get the result you're asking us for. And if it takes longer or it costs more than you want, that's me as a professional just telling you the reality of working with us. You can go with the other guy, and that's fine, and that's your prerogative. All I can comment on is what I know based on my professional experience it should take to deliver the outcome you want. And usually people are like, well, okay then, but it's, you have to really know, and you have to have that level of confidence to be able to say that and to back that up with concrete information. If they start digging into, well, XYZ provider said QA only takes 3 days, whereas you're saying it takes 2 weeks. Why is that? And then you have to be able to go in and back that up with saying, well, we have to do this and this and this and this. You should go back to that other provider and ask them if they're doing all of that for you, right? And you can kind of get them to arrive at, it's all part of the quality, right?
Sure. Excellent points. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's do an individual breakdown of all of these and kind of how they fit into a project plan, so that you can plan. And I'm going to name some specific tools in here. You don't have to use the tools I name, but they are ones that we recommend, including our own product. Of course, I'm a little biased, but we will mention it. So first up is automated testing tools. These can be used at every phase of a website project, and for costs, it's really going to be up to the individual vendor or provider to provide an accurate estimate for you, for your use case, how much you're going to be using, what your volume is, right? And some of these tools might be free, others might be free with a paid component, and there's going to be a little bit of discovery on the agency's end to determine what this costs and try to make that work for you. But there's different automated testing tools that are appropriate depending on the phase. So it's not like one tool for all phases, right? Depending on the phase, you're going to use different tools. If you're in the content phase, for instance, you might use Grackle Docs, which is an automated checker for PDF files. It can automatically scan PDFs, and it can find accessibility deficiencies in a customer's PDFs. So if you're working with government or nonprofit or those types of organizations that dump truckloads of PDFs onto their websites, having Grackle Docs somehow built into your proposal, or a service like Grackle Docs, is probably a good idea, just so that you're making sure that they have coverage on the accessibility front. It's also a great way to pivot the conversation, right? They're like, oh, I don't know if I want to spend this much on remediating my PDF files. And you're like, well, these could be web pages, they don't have to be PDFs. And then you get a search benefit, and your content is more indexable, and et cetera, right? And you can pivot that conversation for service. Nice. During design, if you're doing designs in like Figma and not designing in browser or in inside the CMS, Stark is a great tool that we will always recommend, but it provides a number of different automated accessibility checks inside of Figma. So it will flag, color contrast issues, et cetera, before you're even submitting the designs for customer approval, hopefully, so that you can make sure that before you're getting the customer, emotionally attached to something, that you've dialed in accessibility at least a little bit. And then during development, our tool Accessibility Checker, we think, is a great resource. So if you're building or designing in the browser inside the CMS, that tool provides automated checks directly inside WordPress and provides you with immediate feedback across over 45 different automated accessibility tests. Typically, like I said, these costs will scale across multiple variables. It might be the size or number of websites or the number of tools in use across various platforms, etc. And also a big delineator, and this is something you're going to want to have clarity on, is for any of these automated testing tools, there's really two varieties. One runs on your own server or on your local computer and uses those resources to provide the testing or to facilitate the testing, and the other uses an external server for scanning, usually via some sort of API. The ones that use the external server are typically are the most expensive, and they have the most variability in terms of cost. And it's understandable that company is incurring a cost every time you use the tool if it's on their server. Whereas if you're using something on your own server computer, generally you can save a bit of money there as long as you don't mind using those resources or having it maintain that.
And where as a little plug for you, where does the accessibility checker fit into all of that?
So Accessibility Checker is a great tool for early stage QA while you're developing or building out a website or putting content into it. And it's also great on an ongoing basis. So we see agencies use this as part of their care plan to help maintain the accessibility of a website over time and continuously report on it. And if you're interested in learning more, you can check out the tool at equalizedigital.com/accessibility-checker. There's a live demo and tons of information there. But thank you, Roger. Appreciate that.
Yeah.
On the accessibility evaluation front, generally this is happening in design and QA. During design, we estimate about an hour per designed page in your scope is good for just giving a quick manual accessibility review. This needs to be by a trained individual, so you might be able to find someone on, Fiverr or a similar service who is an accessibility professional who kind of rents themselves out to multiple agencies on an hourly basis, and you can control your costs that way. We also offer similar services for both of these. So you can usually find someone to supplement your team if you don't have this accessibility expertise in-house. And then during QA is the other time we would do manual accessibility evaluations. And generally, just rule of thumb average, if you're looking at what to bill your customer and kind of fit into your cost structure, it's about 4 hours of evaluation time to fully evaluate a header and footer on average, and about 2.5 hours per unique page. So budgeting for that review in the design phase is a smart investment because it can save you time, money, and frustration down the line. Accessibility evaluations involve both different tools, methods. Like this is probably one of your best accessibility testing tools, and everybody has one. For the listening audience, I'm holding up a keyboard. Start tabbing through your website using your spacebar, arrow keys, etc., and see if you can get to every element and navigate fully without using a mouse. And then screen readers, of course, are another major tool, but there's far more than that can be used for testing. Before development is underway, it's definitely critical to spend time understanding how and to what level every theme, block library, page builder you might be using is observing accessibility best practices. We definitely recommend reaching out to those providers and getting information if they have anything formally documented, or if you have like a starter, right? Like a starter set for WordPress where it's like theme set, standard sets of plugins, etc. Getting that up on a staging environment, sticking something like Accessibility Checker on it, or running like Wave or something else, and getting a preliminary list of findings of what your starting point is would be a really good idea, because hopefully your starting point is adding 0 issues to accessibility, at least in an automated tester. And then to determine the number of pages to evaluate during the QA phase, because I know that's going to be important, identify pages with basically key unique elements and make sure that you're testing at least one of each of those pages. So page with accordions, got to test it. If you have a web form on a page, you have to test it. Make sure you're testing one of every major element. And then we have accessibility remediation. So this is happening during development as the site's being built, and also during QA. The cost is really dependent on the results of your testing, right? Which is, never was a more obvious statement said than that, but it's the truth. So you've found the accessibility problems, someone has to fix them. It's really a good idea, particularly if you're new at this, to increase your development and revisions budget to account for the extra time you're going to need. And I say going to because it's almost a guarantee if you're early stage with accessibility, you're going to find problems. But the nice thing about this is, the more you do it, the more you dial in your processes. And by the second project, the third project, the fifth project, you should be so dialed in because you're trying to prevent making the same mistakes over and over again that accessibility gets cheaper and cheaper to fulfill. So like any other endeavor, there's some short-term pain, but there's long-term gain. Generally, as a rule of thumb, and this is based on our direct experience from many, many, many years ago when we first started getting into accessibility, doing, higher ed projects and government projects, you should really add about 20 to 30% to your dev budget for the first accessibility project you do. And after a couple of rounds, it's pretty easy to dial that back to just 10 or 20% above what you used to do before you were, if you were never considering accessibility before.
And I think that's a great kind of rule of thumb in general, right? If you're an agency starting out, overestimate how long it's going to take you to do something. And then as you figure it out, you'll be able to dial it back. So really, really great insights here.
Mm-hmm. And be ready for a learning experience too, and be open to that, right? Because even if you dial it up, depending on what your starting point is with your level of accessibility understanding and what tools you're using, you could be signing up for, and I'm just being real here, that first project may be a break even or a slight financial loss project. But it's that long-term thinking of understanding, okay, I'm going to, take the hit up front 1 or 2 times at most, and then I'm going to understand this, and I'm going to be able to differentiate from my competitors in a flooded marketplace where 95% of websites are delivered with obvious accessibility issues. So captioning transcription is the next item. And this is really, we recommend doing it earlier, like in the content phase, like after discovery or around the design time, because then you have plenty of time to get through everything. But this is generally best to be fulfilled, by an external provider, someone who specializes in captioning and transcription. Empire Captions is great. We use them all the time. I don't have them on this slide specifically, but they're like our go-to, and they do a great job. So as a real world example, there at the last bullet point, Equalize Digital, like we right now pay $2.50 a minute for captions, $1.25 a minute for transcripts for WordPress Accessibility Meetup, our public free education meetup. And you can see the ranges up here. So captions can range, depending on the complexity of the content, anywhere from $2 to $10 a minute. Transcripts $1 to $3 a minute. And then audio description, which is where someone is actually describing what is visually happening on the screen, is between $15 or $30 a minute, because it requires, like, they will usually use some very creative and floral language to describe things. And it's really cool. If you've never listened to a movie with audio description on, it's kind of like the best version of like a podcast where they're doing storytelling, because it's really, really good. And then you get all the quality of the actor's audio as well.
Awesome.
Generally, that audio description is kind of something that not everyone has to do, right? But if you do a lot of video content, you want to go above and beyond and meet like AAA requirements, audio descriptions, definitely a good idea. And then we have ASL interpretation. So this is bringing in someone, like I said, to do interpreting in American Sign Language for spoken word content. Generally, it's between $75 and $150 an hour for that. And generally, this is being done on like live events, but you can also do it after the fact for static video content. And I think it's somewhat audience dependent, but it is, one thing that's not really understood very often is that American Sign Language is truly like its own language. It's not like they're just taking English and translating it into motions and visuals. It is really its own language and its own culture, and has its own unique way of expressing ideas and concepts and words. And it's not a direct one-to-one translation. So if you want to really massively increase the value of your content for that particular audience, ASL interpretation is a great thing to do.
Awesome. And, just as a quick pin on that, I see these videos sometimes of concerts where the interpreter is really getting into it. And I mean, that speaks to what you're saying there. Like, there's so much more to it than just like the words. It's really an emotive situation. So pretty cool. Yeah, absolutely. And if like you said, like concerts, movies, like all sorts of things like that, it is really fascinating to watch that.
Next up is doc and PDF accessibility. This is also content phase, also provided by an external provider. And this is also the last one in our definitions list for anyone who's starting to maybe fall asleep a little bit. I'm almost through these. But the evaluation for a doc or a PDF should be somewhere between $1 and $3 a page. And then if you're going to have them fix it for you and not fix it yourself, it's between $3 and $15 per page. And that is entirely dependent on the complexity. So for instance, we have this 40-page ebook that has tons of different design accents and layouts and like different ways that we change and modify the pages to make it more engaging and not just a straight black and white document. That was about $18.75 a page to evaluate and remediate. If you have something that's really simple, and just white text, black text, white background, just headings and text and lists and whatever else, that's going to be way less than what I have listed here. If you have to have PDFs, we would always advise not having PDFs and docs and just having that be a web page if at all possible. But if you've got to have them, here's your information for what that costs. It's more affordable than you think. So I want to, now that we've kind of gone through the costs and everything, I want to kind of end with, as we wrap this up, like one more big truth nugget, which is ignoring the cost of accessibility does not make it go away. That cost turns into debt. So why is it debt? I'll explain, of course. So here's how accessibility debt manifests. The first one is lost time. So it will take more time and effort to go back and fix accessibility issues, and you're going to lose productivity from your teams as they have to go back and do over to correct issues that were entirely preventable if some better planning had been put in place. Then we have deficient UX. So we have decreased usability for all users. This is something that's commonly misunderstood, is accessibility is not just for people who are blind or who are deaf or who have a motor impairment or a cognitive issue. It is for everyone. And the improvements that you make for those subsets of the audience that needs these types of features, you're actually going to have this ripple effect where your website as a whole will kind of rise up and you will see your statistics go up. And we have documented proof that when you just improve accessibility, you don't change the design, you don't change the language, you don't change anything else, you just improve accessibility fundamentals. We did this with a community college earlier last year, and they saw time on page go up, bounce rate go down, enrollments go up, people reaching out go up. So it really does make a difference. And the people who were converting or were staying on the page, there is proof that they have that some of those people were what I'm going to call, just in the vernacular, everyday people, right? People like myself who didn't need to use a screen reader necessarily or didn't need to use a keyboard. It's just that overall UX benefit translated directly to improved statistics, improved user experience for 100% of the audience, not a subset of it. Then we have lost revenue. So loss of potential customers, reduced loyalty, and potentially negative impact on your brand, and then increased risk. So you're borrowing from your future peace of mind because your risk of lawsuits, fines, regulatory actions may be quite high, depending on your location and industry, if you have an inaccessible site. So when someone says something like, we just can't fit accessibility into this scope, project, phase, whatever, what I want you to hear them saying is, I'd like to take out a short-term loan from my future time, user experience, revenue, and risk profile. It's equally important to stress that accessibility is not all or nothing. So if you can only fix what automated scanners are finding, or if you can only manually evaluate like the header, footer, and homepage and fix those issues, that is still substantially more than zero. And people like me in the accessibility space are always going to encourage you to do more because that's our literal job. But we're going to also cheer you on for doing something, right? So remember, it's progress, not perfection, and every bit of effort you put in now eliminates debt in these key 4 areas later. So to wrap us up here, hopefully we understand why accessibility should be a priority, the importance of having frequent accessibility touchpoints in projects, major components needed to budget for accessibility in a project, and why omitting accessibility now doesn't make it go away, it just makes it become debt. So next time we're going to actually well, again, you need to like, share, comment, make sure Kinsta knows this is content you want to see again. But next time, hopefully, if I'm invited back, we're going to translate all of this into a real world situation. We're going to dig into numbers, both in terms of time and cost and dollars. And we're going to show the very real cost of ignoring or deprioritizing accessibility. And we're going to do it based on this sample project scope that I have on the screen here, which is a custom theme or brochure website with 5 design pages, a contact form, and content that includes 25 total pages, 10 PDFs that are totaling 30 pages, and a 5-minute video. So we're going to get, as you can see, really specific with numbers and what 2 versions of approaching this look like and what the cost of ignoring it might be, depending on the type of organization. So hopefully see y'all next time. And I can take any additional questions, if any dropped in the chat, or if Roger has more.
No, absolutely. That was great. Thank you so much, Chris. The insights, always are coming in whenever I hear you talk. And I think, one interesting nugget to really dig into here is how accessibility helps all of the users of your website. And I think there's a parallel to that in planning your projects and the way that you're outlining how developers should be planning their projects. This goes outside of accessibility. I mean, accessibility needs to be included into it, but the way that you're breaking things down there, I know so many people, and I know I suffer for this when I work on projects. I don't do a good job of just breaking things down so that as an agency, I'm finding profitability. So thank you again for the insights there. We've got Troy is saying thank you. He thought it was really great. So
thanks,
that's always
Troy.
nice to hear. Yeah, man. Before we get out of here, and I'm definitely going to invite you back. I want to hear what you have to say, and I hope everybody else does too. But, as we kind of leave this segment and kind of prepare people for what you're going to talk about in the next one, what are like some really important things that you think people aren't taking into consideration when it comes to accessibility, getting outside of the legal requirements? Why is accessibility so important for people to really be paying attention to?
I think, to boil it down to one nugget, I think it is the missing component of a holistic, what I'm going to call quality stack. So we talk a lot about performance, security, discoverability, regardless of the technology people are using to discover you, whether that's social search, AI. I think accessibility and usability is the one that is sometimes missing from having deep and detailed consideration. And when you ignore that, I think it's this invisible cost, and it's this quasi-invisible weight that a business or an organization may not be able to directly perceive, right? Because they don't really know what they're missing until they add this in and they see their conversions go up, they see their traffic go up, they see their brand reputation go up, and they see that they're insulated from all of these emerging risks, whether that's the EU Accessibility Act or increased and expanded enforcement of the ADA Title II here in the US, or the Unruh Civil Rights Act in California, generating more and more lawsuits every single year. I think it was like 4,500 total lawsuits around accessibility in the US last year. 80% targeted at e-commerce, by the way. So you know that when we do our next case study, it's going to be an e-commerce case study around risk and lost revenue. But I think there's just so much that just due to a lack of education and advocacy at the highest levels that people just aren't aware of. And that's why I'm having these conversations, because I want more people to understand the amount of things that accessibility touches and what it can do to enhance outcomes. Because it's about way more, and to be clear, it's about individuals with disabilities, very much so, but it is about way more than that too. And at the end of the day, I don't think that anyone in the web space, I like to be like an optimist, right? I don't think anyone in the web space wants to intentionally exclude people And I'll just harken back to our prior conversation. When you decide against accessibility, that's literally what you're doing. You're deciding that a subset of your audience doesn't deserve to access your content or your interface or your portal or whatever it is. And that's not good. That's not good. It hurts you. It hurts them. It's a lose-lose-lose situation, whereas adopting accessibility is a win-win-win situation. And if you're an agency, that means you win. It means your customer wins, and it means your customer's customer wins. So why would you not? That's my closing thought.
No, I think that's a perfect way to close out on this. Troy asked if there's going to be a video link. There will be. I will get it up onto YouTube as quick as I can. The LinkedIn will have a link to it as well immediately. But man, Chris, thank you so much again for all of your insights and knowledge. If people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way for them to reach out?
Just send me an email, chris@equalizedigital.com, or I'm here on LinkedIn, just to DM away. So either one.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Keep your eyes and ears open on LinkedIn for the next session, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Broadcast has ended. Record.